going to share his page.
And hopefully what I'm sharing is my PowerPoint slides. Everyone see that?
Excellent.
Excellent. Well, I guess firstly, I want to thank you, Cheryl, for giving me the opportunity to present to your group. I know that you guys are growing exponentially, which is fantastic to see that there's vibrancy in the different networks. So I guess we're growing, you're growing. It just goes to show that I guess the industry itself is going really, really well. So thank you for the opportunity to present. Today is a little bit of an overview on feasibilities, as Cheryl indicated. This is a little bit of a subset out of a larger program that I teach. I won't go into all of that now, but what I want to give you is a little bit of an insight as to the different things that you're going to look for in going into a feasibility, because the number one, well, not the number one, I get so many number one questions, it's not funny, but one of the biggest questions I get is all about the feasibility software. And the biggest thing that I want to get you guys to take away is that the software really just does the adding and subtracting. There's actually a number of elements that go into it that really rely on your skills and your ability that, I guess, enable the correct data to go into the software. You've probably heard the expression garbage in, garbage out. So if you don't get these elements right, then your feasibility is going to look fantastic, but unfortunately it won't actually be a true reflection of how the project actually runs. So with that in mind, I'm going to go through some of those elements for you so that you've got a little bit of an understanding. So the two most critical elements that you want in a feasibility comes down to the ability to do your site analysis correctly, okay? If you get your site analysis incorrect, you will not identify the problems that actually sit on the site. And if you don't identify the problems, you won't be able to cost them. And if you can't cost them, then you'll never be able to actually put that into your feasibility. So one of the biggest things that I can recommend to you is to get good at your site analysis. And if you don't know how, then find yourself an educator, find yourself a mentor that specializes in your particular strategy. And there are so many different development strategies out there, it's not funny, but find the one that's going to suit your strategy. And then you will know the kinds of costs that you need to identify and the kinds of problems that you're going to be looked for. So identifying the problem is the first part. And then what you're then going to do is engage with your appropriate consultants. I guess you're going to have a team of experts that sit around you, and you're going to give them your analysis of the site. You're going to get them to firstly sanity check that the analysis you've done is correct. And then with their expert opinions, get them to give you some estimates as to what those costs are actually going to be, because they would have done hundreds and hundreds of projects very similar to yours. So a mandatory set of consultants that you're going to engage with will be a town planner, a civil engineer, and an architect. But there are a ton more. So depending upon the issue that you're trying to solve and the strategy that you're on, you may have anywhere up to 20 or 30 different consultants that you may need to engage in the process. Anywhere from disability consultants, bushfire consultants, I guess traffic engineers, sound and acoustic engineers, arborists, all the sorts of things that you might deal with when you have a problem on your site. So that's the first thing, is get your site analysis correct. The second thing you need to do is understand what the sale of the finished product is going to be. So it doesn't matter how well you run your project, but if you get the sale of the finished product wrong in your initial assessment, then it doesn't matter how perfect you run it. The project just won't be profitable because you got that wrong. And then a feasibility is really just the adding and subtracting of those two elements. Identify the problem, I guess identify the costs of those problems, what's it going to sell for, and then you just add and subtract doing that. And that sounds really simple, and because of that, that's the end of my speech. No, in reality, there's plenty more. I didn't want to psych you out that quickly, but there's plenty more that actually goes into it. So if we have a look at some other elements that you might want to be considering, okay? So other considerations, and this is going to be very subjective as you go. So the project timelines, okay? This is going to impact your holding costs. You need to understand how long it's going to take you to get your development approval. And that is going to be very subjective based on the council that you're dealing with, the kind of project that you're dealing with, and also the complexity of that, because some councils have a fast track process and others have a very slow and laborious process where you need to get feedback from the entire community and that sort of thing. So understanding just your development approval timeline is critical, let alone then I've got to actually go and construct it and then go and sell it at the tail end. If you don't understand those elements, that's really going to blow out your holding costs. So critical that you get that right. And with regards to the sale of the finished product, that comes down to how well you do your market analysis. Have you understood that the product that you're creating suits the demographic in the area? What is the supply and demand of those? All of those sorts of things are critical in that process. The next thing that you want to do is you want to assess multiple outcomes for the one site. There's always more than one way to skin a cat. And so when you're looking at your project, you may find that there are 3 or 4 potential ways to actually develop that. And you want to go through the different permutations of not just profitability, but the different permutations of timeline and complexity in that in order to determine which is your best outcome through a thing called highest and best use, which I'll touch on in a moment. Cash flow is king, okay? So it doesn't matter what the profit says at the end of the deal if you can't actually fund the deal as you go. So you're going to have a whole bunch of costs that you're going to have to cash flow as you go. So you're going to have to pay all of your consultants, pay all the application fees, all of that sort of thing as you go, pay for the construction. That's money that leaves your pocket through the entire process. If you don't understand that cash flow element of things, you may find that you may never be able to get to that finished product. And so you may have to consider, given the limited resources I've got in my cash flow, maybe I can't take it all the way through to completion. And so that's going to bring you back to, I guess, the previous step, which is multiple outcomes for the one site. So are you selling it development approved? Are you selling it with building approval? Are you selling it just with the civils in place and the subdivision done? Are you taking it all the way through to construction? They're all the different things that your cash flow may actually impact along the way. Now, where that comes down to is a terminology called highest and best use. So highest and best use is the maximum profit with the least amount of hassle in the least amount of time. Now, that is not always the maximum density of a site. And now allow me to explain what I mean by that. You may find, for example, that your particular site has multiple development capabilities. It might be that you could do units. It might be that you can do townhouses. It might be that you could actually subdivide and put house blocks on the same plot of land. So if you do those permutations on each of those, you may find that the demand for units in the area is very, very low, which means that your timelines are going to blow out. The sale of the finished product is not going to be very high. The cost to construct that, because it's a very different kind of construction that involves a lot of concrete and heavy materials, might be very high. So the profitability in that is going to be quite low and the timeline is going to be quite high. You reassess that exact same deal and you say, well, now we're going to put townhouses on there instead. And when you look at the supply and demand in the area, townhouses are a lot more palatable, in a lot more demand. They're lightweight materials, a lot cheaper to actually construct, very, very popular. You can get a slightly higher price point for them. And then you do the third permutation, which is maybe we can do this as a pure subdivision and put some really nice homes on there. And when you do that, you might find that the demand for that is much, much higher again, and the sale of the finished product is even greater. And so when you do those different permutations, you may find that the highest and best use is not the maximum density, because that maximum density is not popular in that particular area. When you go to the next area, it might be that maximum density is the most popular, and maybe the maximum density can be highest and best use in that particular instance. If we look at, I guess, the different elements that go into that, we then want to try and capture all of that in some form of software or on the back of the envelope, if you're so inclined, to actually add and subtract all of the different elements and permutations that actually go into the deal. And so some of those bits of software out there, and I'll touch on the most popular ones out there. So some feasibility software platforms out there, there's one called Estate Master. And you notice I've said not published. They don't publish their price point. You actually need to give them a call and talk to one of their salespeople, and then you'll be on their spam list for a very long time before they'll actually reveal what the cost of it is. It's been a very long time since I've actually done that exercise to understand what the cost of it is, but it's somewhere in the vicinity of thousands of dollars in order to do that. Estate Master is a fantastic platform for very, very big projects. So if you're the kind of person who's doing multi-stage developments or multi-rise or perhaps 30 or more townhouses, then Estate Master is something that's going to scale really, really well for you. But as a entry-level developer, it's probably a little bit overkill for what you guys are actually looking for. Dev fees, or what was previously called Fees Study, that has a price range between $220 to $770 to purchase it, depending upon the level of features that you're looking for, and I guess the amount of capability you want that platform to have. Plus you have an annual subscription to that product so that every single year you have to pay the maintenance in order to get all the updates as they bring out new features and capabilities. There's another one called Fees Report. This is anywhere between $55 and $220 per month for that particular platform. In order to do that, I guess you have to pay that ongoing basis. And again, it depends on the features that you're looking for to get there. And then lastly is one called QwikFeaso. That's a $250 one-off payment with updates for life. And QwikFeaso is my favorite one. And I say that because it's the one I wrote. I had I had over 20 years in IT before going into the full-time property development space. And so I have written that some time ago and I guess continually to maintain it. But what are some of the elements that actually go into a feasibility? So if we have a look at it, there's a number of elements that are going to be absolutely consistent every single time. So what are deemed to be fixed costs, and they're very predictable every single time. And there are also ones that are very subjective to the individual development that you're doing at that particular time. I'm going to cover the very high level elements to them here just so that we've got a little bit of an understanding, but and I'll do it in the order that they will typically appear as you go through your project. Now I can see that Cheryl has attempted to do a chat to me in the background to inform me of something, but I cannot for the life of me see that chat. So Cheryl, if it's something that you need to do, just yell out to me, would be fantastic.
Just a quick question, Rob. Do funders, lenders, whether it's the banks or private lenders, require a feasibility to be in any particular format? Say, for example, do they require it to be in estate master format or anything more than an Excel spreadsheet?
No, that's a fantastic question. Typically, the funders will actually have their own internal proprietary spreadsheets that they're actually dealing with. And no matter what format you give it to them in, they will reverse engineer the data you've given them and then plug it into their platform. And that way they're always getting the exact same answers into their credit assessment teams. Now, they've built those up proprietary over quite a number of years, but they tend to be quite simplistic in their approach. I guess some of the higher end, commercial funders, so when you get into the commercial development funding space, they may use one of the bigger platforms like your Fees Study and Dev Fees and that sort of thing for themselves because they don't have any in-house technology to do that. But typically, the big four banks will use their own in-house proprietary stuff.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And another question from Giuseppe. Do these softwares that you've just mentioned do the market analysis as well? I.e. you type in the postcode or you actually need to input all data yourself?
No, they do absolutely none of the actual work. All they do is the adding and subtracting. And so all of the reliance is on you to actually do the full assessment of the site, the full costings, the cash flow analysis. So they'll help with the cash flow timelines. But when it comes to the assessment of the site itself, you'll have to be subscribing to a whole range of software platforms to actually gather the data that you need to plug into the feasibility.
That's right. Actually, one that may do that is probably Archistar, which I don't know if you've used before.
I've used Archistar. Archistar is a very, very, very simplistic feasibility, and it doesn't do any of the elements that I'm about to go through. Sorry, it only does a small subset of the elements I'm about to go through. And so you want to be very, very careful that you're using a feasibility based on something as simplistic as that to make your decisions. Where it becomes advantageous to use something like that is it gives you an order of magnitude accuracy to say, should I be putting any more effort into the site? And I'm actually going to talk to that a little bit in a sec, I guess, with regards to how we do an order of magnitude assessment to make sure that we're in the right ballpark.
Okie dokie. No more questions for me.
That's okay. But because I can't see the chat window for some reason, I think it's because we're trying to do Facebook and Zoom at the same time. Just feel free to yell them out. So I guess the different elements, and this tends to be the order that they appear in as you're actually running through a project. So the first thing will be purchase costs. So there's the purchase price itself, which you clearly know from the contract that you've written, but there's also things like stamp duty, legals, and accounting. So I count the legals and accounting because depending upon what you're trying to do, whether you're trying to do it as a joint venture, whether you're trying to do it with private loans with other people on the side, if you have to set up some sort of entity to actually create this, many people forget to put their accounting costs in there. And you should be capturing this, not just the cost to set up the accounting, but also the cost to ongoing manage and run that and do the final closeout of the project at the very, very end, including all your tax returns. Equally, your legals should capture not just the original purchase price, but should also be capturing things like, well, I'm going to be selling many of the finished product. So if you're buying one property and you're selling 6 townhouses, for example, then your legals should include 1 purchase and 6 sales of 6 off-the-plan contracts for the townhouses. So make sure you're capturing all of those elements, and then you're not just going, oh yeah, it's going to cost me a couple $100 for conveyancing. It can add up quite quickly when in looking at those things. Then you've got things like holding costs. Now, I'm obviously trying to be simplistic here. There's a hell of a lot more holding costs and a hell of a lot more elements to each of these as we go. But the holding costs are the costs that are just going to keep hitting you as the project keeps running. So you've got your rates, you've got your land tax, electricity, depending upon the kind of property that you might have. Maybe you've bought an existing complex. You might have some body corporate fees because you bought an entire complex you're going to knock down. All of those things kind of add up as you go, and the longer the project takes, the more that's then going to impact. There's also elements like land tax that are very subjective to the specific date that you actually own the property at. So, for example, not in every state, but in many states, land tax is calculated on a single day of the year. Do you own the property, yes or no? And so on the 30th of June, midnight, at the end of the financial year, if you own the property, you get hit with land tax. If you don't own the property, you don't. So if you happen to have finished the project inside a financial year, start it and finish it in 1 year, then you won't get hit by land tax. But if you are unlucky and you've signed up just before the financial year started, then as soon as you tick over, you get 1 land tax. And if your project goes for more than 12 months, you get another land tax. You need to make sure that you're very aware of that with regards to, I guess, the duration of your project. Next element would be funding costs. So there's application fees, valuer fees, interest. There's also things called line fees, which if you're going into the commercial space that you may need to consider. The bigger the project gets, the more your funding costs are actually then going to start to hit. So when you're small scale and you're doing residential, these costs may seem quite minor and insignificant, but as you start to scale your projects, your application fees can be in the vicinity of anywhere from $30,000 to $100,000, for example. Your valuer fees, the most I've paid for a valuation is around $30K in itself. And then your interest is then broken up into a line fee, which is you being able to reserve the money for the duration of the period, and then the interest as I guess, the money as you draw it down itself. Then you've got your typical development costs themselves. So these are all the consultants that you're going to pay for in the process, the town planner, the architects, any application fees through to council, et cetera, and until you actually get the development approval. And that may go back and forth a number of times if council are asking you lots of questions about your particular development, and you may have to re-engage your consultants many times in the process to answer council's questions and resubmit through a thing called an RFI, or request for information. So you need to make sure that you understand the complexity of your project to understand, is that going to be a quick approval process and not many questions come through, or is that quite a complex approval and you need to anticipate a little bit more budget for each of those consultants as you go. The next element would be, assuming you get your development approval and you're going to go through to some form of construction, whether it be constructing to subdivide the land or whether it be through to constructing some form of dwelling on the property, almost invariably you're going to have to do some civil costs. So you got water, sewer, stormwater, gas, electricity, driveways, all those sorts of things that actually go into feed and water the site so that it is able to live and breathe long after you've well and truly gone. Now, those costs are very subjective to the site itself, understanding things like the contours, which way, I guess, the property is sloping, where the services are they in your property? Are they in the road network? Are they in a neighbour's property? Those sorts of things can greatly impact those costs. And also the number of dwellings that you're actually creating and the additional demands you're supplying on the network. You need to assess whether or not the services that are already there that are owned by the utility provider, whether or not they need some form of upgrade in order to get there. And if you're going to do some of these projects out in, I guess, the fringes of the city, it may be that none of these services are actually there in place at all, and it's going to be you that installs all of them and actually plug them back in. So they can be very quite expensive in that process. Now, the next one would be building approval costs. Now, depending upon, I guess, the state that you're in, some of these terminologies will actually change, obviously, but building approval cost or construction certificate, depending upon where you're located, is taking the development approved plans that you got from council and then turning that into an engineering level drawing that gives you the level of detail that the builder needs to actually construct the dwelling. So it understands things like, what is the soil type that we're going to be operating on and constructing on, which impacts the kind of foundations and the depth of the foundations that you're actually going to be doing. It's then going to look at things like, well, what kind of, are we doing lightweight materials? Are we doing heavy materials? Are we constructing out of wood? Are we constructing out of steel? You know, what sort of steel, what sort of size beams are we needing in this? What are the specifications of the product that we're putting in place? It's going to look at things like your lighting, your electricals, your fixtures, your fittings, all of those sorts of things that are then going to have a stamped approval that says this is what the builder is actually going to build. Then you've actually got the construction costs themselves. So the builder will typically give you these in some form of breakout, but when you break it down, there's an insurance element that is compulsory to be paid that protects the ultimate owner of the property in case that building falls down. So it's a homeowner's warranty insurance that protects them. There's all the site prep work. So, you know, do they need to clean the site? Do they need to level it? All those sorts of things. Putting things like temporary fences on the property, portaloos, that sort of thing. And then you've got the different stages that you're going to be constructing. So there's the slab, the frame, the roof, lock-up, all of those sorts of things, okay? And then the quality of the fixtures and fittings that you're actually putting inside the property will greatly impact the costs as well. So you can put very cheap tiles, you can put very expensive tiles. You can put things that look good but aren't very expensive, or you can go, I guess, the full tilt as you go. And something that many people forget about is all of the supplementary things that happen after construction that would get you to a point of this being I guess, a habitable dwelling. And that's things like putting driveways in, landscaping, fences, letterboxes, clotheslines, that sort of thing. So what is called a turnkey construction. Many people forget about that when they actually go out to tender for their construction, and they get this very wide cross-section of price points from their builders, because they're not all quoting on the same thing. Some of them are quoting at turnkey, and some of them are quoting for just the dwelling itself. Then you've got all the authority fees and charges. So depending upon the state and the jurisdiction that you're in, sometimes they're called council contributions, sometimes they're called infrastructure charges, sometimes they're called headworks. I guess they're all the connection fees that you need to pay for, and the taxes that are impacted by all of the different relevant authorities. Now, the last time I actually did a count of those, there's in the vicinity of 20 to 25 different taxes that you get impacted by different authorities at different stages that you need to try and capture. Then you've got the plan sealing process. Now, plan sealing is the very last step that you do before you actually get your titles. So it is taking the constructed elements that you've done and going to prove to council that you actually met all of the development approval conditions that they placed on you way back at the development approval stage. And so you need to go and say, well, here is the condition, and here is proof that I've actually done that, and provide a level of evidence, submit that to council. And when you've submitted it to council, they then do an assessment to see whether or not you've actually done that to the level of standard that they were actually looking for. And if you haven't, then you won't get your approvals. And if you don't get your approvals, then you can't lodge for titles. The challenge is, because this is one of the last steps in the process, you are at maximum debt at this point in the process. So if you have not prepared for this very early, and some of the elements that you need to capture, you need to have done months in advance because of the lead time involved. It can blow out your timelines massively when you're at peak debt. So your holding costs blow out massively. Then you've got the sales income. So sales income can be broken up a couple of different ways. You may have to be selling off the plan in order to get your finance approval, or alternatively, you may get post sales, which is selling the finished product at the very, very end. But irrespective of that is the only piece of income that actually occurs through the entire project. So everything else is an expense other than selling of the finished product. So it's money leaving your leaving your pocket, I should say, during the whole process. And the only day you get paid is the day you sell the finished product and actually settle on the finished product. And even then you get more costs, and that is the agent's commissions fees, any marketing costs and that sort of thing that may actually go into the process as well. And then finally, you've got your project closeouts, which is the legals and accounting that I was touching on way at the start, where you need to then go and capture all of your taxes, pay all of those, any BAS that you may have had to do along the way, GST that you've had to do, et cetera, any company tax depending upon the entity that you've done it in. And what I would say in covering all of that is this is by no means a complete list. I guess this is really just headline acts to try and give you some concepts to say, what are we actually going to put into our feasibility so that we've got the right things that we're actually looking for. And for every single project, whilst you've got these headline items, the level of detail that you need to go to in each one is going to be completely different.
I have some questions, if I may.
Absolutely.
Okie doke. So land tax. So going back to land tax, question from Matt. Regarding land tax, is it applicable if the property is not actually being developed, i.e. it's being rented out pending DA approval?
Absolutely. So this is a state government tax. Now, the answer to this is going to be slightly different in every single state, but it's effectively a tax just for the privilege of owning the property. And depending upon the entity that you own it in will determine the rate at which that land tax actually applies. So it's not the usage of the land and what you're doing with it, but it's actually instead the entity that you own it in. If you own it in your personal name, then you generally get a little bit of a threshold differential compared to if you own it in a company or a trust. And every single state has a slightly different variation on where that threshold sits.
Excellent. And Wynne says that land tax cutoff date is different in various states.
It would be, absolutely. I guess it's impossible to be an expert in every single jurisdiction, but what I would say is the majority of states tend to do it at end of financial year because that's when they're doing their numbers, but there's probably one or two that don't, but don't quote me which ones don't.
And can I just add, obviously, like I said, this is not an exhaustive list, that we, and you'll probably be mentioning this, a contingency. How much do we put in for contingency?
So that's an excellent question. Your contingency is going to be very subjective to the complexity of the project and your level of experience in running that project. So in the early days when you're, I guess, just learning the process, sorry, a bit of noise in the background. My wife is doing some cooking. So excuse me a sec while I quieten her down.
Rob does his thing. I'll play the elevator music in the meantime.
I'm back. Sorry, I forgot the question. Cheryl, if you can refresh me on the...
Contingencies.
Contingency. So in your early days, I'd be suggesting that you might be wanting to sit somewhere in and around the 10% mark. As you get more and more experienced, as you understand the level of complexity of the deal, you may shrink that down to somewhere around the 5% mark. What I would be cautious of is to say that when you're doing the costings in all of these other line items that you've done here, you should be as accurate as humanly possible and then let the contingency capture the variation. What tends to happen, I see in, I guess, early developers as they're learning the process, is they get quite conservative on every single line item, and then they add contingency as well. And what it does is put fat on top of fat. And so when you do that, you tend to blow your feasibility out, and it's very, very hard to actually make the feasibility stack. If you try to be as accurate as humanly possible, one, you'll get much, much better at that level of accuracy over time as you get feedback from your different consultants and actually start to run deals. But two, it means that your contingency is a lot more realistic and a lot more manageable. Now, while we're talking about the contingency, I consider contingency an absolute cost in the project, and I don't count it towards my profit. I consider it an expense that is already spent when it comes to assessing the viability of the deal. When it comes to the running of the deal, I do the exact reverse. I do everything humanly possible to never ever spend it, in which case if I don't spend it, then my deal becomes more profitable, I guess, just in the fact that I didn't spend the money. And so, you know, when you're looking at it that way, it makes it much more easy to compare, I guess, the profitability of a deal. Please don't ever consider contingency as a form of profit that's not yet spent.
And one more, I've got two more questions. One is from Matt, and I'll start with Matt. How much detail would you go into estimating the construction cost? Would you tend to get pricing off a builder or perhaps use a Rawlinson's?
I'm actually going to go through the level of detail, I guess, conversation in a moment. So I'll save a little bit of that till later. But what I would say is that there's a number of different ways to get your building costs, and the level of detail is going to get more and more accurate as you get further and further into the process. So in the right up front, when you haven't got your development approval in place and you haven't got your designs, you're really doing a very high level costing. As you get your development approvals in place, your level of detail becomes a lot greater. And then as you get your building approval and you know exactly the level of engineering that you're going to, you can get even more accurate again. So it gets much more accurate as you go. Now, I'm going to call out, folks, that we're having quite a significant thunderstorm where I am. I don't think the sound is coming through to you guys, but if for some reason I just suddenly disappear, it's because there's some sort of electrical interference, but I promise I am here in spirit.
Okay. Excellent. No, I think we can continue. I did have another question around development management fees, but I'm mindful to not sort of hang on to this page for too long. So I'll let you continue.
Oh, good.
Question time after we'll
Absolutely. Then I guess the next thing to do is there are two completely different ways to do a feasibility. One is called a bottom up and the other one is called a top down. And I'm going to go through the pros and cons of each of these so that you actually understand the concept that sits behind it. So firstly, a bottom up. This is what most developers tend to do, especially in the early days. So the vendor tends to stipulate the price. You then try to work out the cost that is actually going to take for the construction. You work out what it's going to sell for, and then you try to work out whether or not you can live with the profit that's left over. So the answer that you get is the profit. Whereas if you look at the exact same numbers, but you actually look at it in a very different approach, if you take it as a top down, this way what we do is we start with the end in mind and we work out what the finished product will sell for. We firstly subtract the profit that we actually want. Now, anyone who's read Robert Kiyosaki, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, rule number one is pay yourself first. So if you want to lock in your profit, then you subtract that from the sale of the finished product right up front. Then you subtract the anticipated cost to develop and or construct. And then anything that's left over is the most that you should pay in order to purchase the property if you want to meet your profit target. So in this instance, the answer provided tends to be, what is the price point that I should be buying the property for? Very different approach. That the inputs are very, very similar, but it really comes down to, one, can I live with the profit? And the other way is, how can I lock in my profit? Now, with a top-down approach, what you're going to find is you'll probably throw more sites away because it won't meet the profit target that you really, in your heart of hearts, want to lock in. But when you do lock one in, let me reassure you that if you've done those costings right, you've pretty much guaranteed that you've got that profit at the tail end. Whereas if you do a bottom-up approach, you're kind of doing a, geez, I hope I got it right type scenario, because you're already squeezing your profit right at the very start. And so we want to make sure that we are comfortable that the profit that is sitting there is actually to the degree that you actually want. This touches on the previous question that we had next, which is the level of accuracy that comes into a deal. Now, I consider this very much a spiral. And as you get closer and closer to the center of the spiral, you're going to get more and more accurate in the process. So if you think right at the very start of the project, you don't know all the answers. It's impossible to know all the answers because you're still in the early stages and you're trying to work out what if this goes wrong and this problem I'm trying to solve. So in your due diligence stage, the level of accuracy that you've got in those numbers is quite wide. Now, as you go through to the next stage of the project, then you get your development approval. At this point, you get a little bit more certainty. So firstly, you know what your development approval costs have been, so they're pretty much already locked in place. And you also know the conditions that council are going to invoke on you in order to go and take the rest of it through to completion. So now you can actually start to cost things with a lot more accuracy. Then the next stage would be, well, we go and get our building approval. Now we know all of the engineering level details that we need to worry about as to, are we doing lightweight construction? Are we doing more traditional construction? What sort of fixtures and fittings are we in there for? How deep are the foundations and footings, et cetera, et cetera. And as you see, we get closer and closer into that center of the spiral. And the practical reality is that the only day that you are ever going to know the actual costs of the project is the day that it finishes. And that's the only day where every single cost has been locked in and the sale price is 100% locked away. And so what you need to do is get yourself comfortable with being uncomfortable. You need to be comfortable that in your due diligence stage, you don't have the level of accuracy that you need right now in order to know with absolute certainty that this deal is actually going to lock in. And so how do you know that you're within the right order of magnitude that you justify you want to go to the next stage? And that's really where your feasibility numbers come in, and how you actually approach the feasibility, that I think I do a little bit different to many of the other developers that sit out there. So as I said, the only time you know exactly the final costs is the day the project actually finishes. And the reason why I do this slightly differently is I take a very fundamental different approach. So I have a methodology that I call the Rapid Elimination method, where I have some high level tasks that I do in my process that tries to work out initially in that due diligence phase, I guess the early stages of that, whether or not I'm even in the right order of magnitude of profitable. So I'm not going to put any more effort in unless it's even in the ballpark of being profitable. So this is not down to the dollar accurate, because it's impossible to be that accurate early. It's just, am I close enough that I actually want to put more effort in? As we go further and further into the process, my feasibility software enables me to then go to an extra layer of detail. And then as we get further and further in the process, go into an extra layer of detail again. So there's pretty much 3 stages in the level of accuracy that we go into in the feasibility that I run. And so the software that I've built to do this is called QwikFeaso. Now, QwikFeaso, as I said before, I had 20 odd years in IT. I actually originally built QwikFeaso as a smartphone app to actually run on your Apple and Android devices. And for about 3 or 4 years, it was running on that platform. And we had nearly 4,000 users using it at the time. And the biggest question that I kept coming back from all of those users was, this is fantastic, but can I please have it as a spreadsheet? And so when it came time to actually update the platforms, because Android had updated and Apple had updated their basic software platforms, I bit the bullet and said, well, why don't we give people what they're actually looking for? And I converted it back to an Excel spreadsheet. So what it actually does is it uses those different levels that I was talking about before to go through 3 different stages that follow, I guess, the teachings that I teach in that Rapid Elimination method. So first stage is a quick and dirty. So we want minimal input that we can, using some, in inverted commas, typical costs. And that's just going to say, are we even in the ballpark of this being worthwhile? Then we're going to go to a more detailed assessment, where we're going to look at the idiosyncrasies of the particular site and try and identify some of the issues and challenges there. And we're going to override those typical costs with some little bit more realistic costs. And then when we get into the full due diligence stage, then we've got actually hundreds of different line items that are actually built into it. And we can go down to the individual line item and say, well, how much is this exact element going to cost me? The concept that I've done to actually build this is designed to be very flexible with everybody's different development strategy. And there are hundreds of different development strategies out there. And so I've developed it in a way it can actually be very customizable to preload a whole bunch of your particular strategies in with the typical costs that you know about your particular area. Now, I say this very clearly because a simple strategy, and I'll just use subdivision as an example, a subdivision that is done in Brisbane is going to cost completely different to one done in Sydney, which is going to be completely different to one done in Melbourne. Not only that, but because there are 30 odd councils within Sydney, 17 odd councils within Melbourne, even within one city, there are multiple different variations of the costs. And so it's very important that you load your typical costs for your particular strategy and your particular jurisdiction into the back end stage of this in order to become, I guess, to load up those typical costs in the back end. So having said that, I'm going to assume that everyone would actually like to see a little bit of a working example of how QwikFeaso works. Can I hear the crowd at this point? Yay, here we go. So as I said, it's an Excel spreadsheet. Now, before I go through how to use the software, what I want to do is just show you some of the back end side of things and the inputs that go into it, which when you load it up really quick, enable you to get those results very, very fast. Now, most of these are a one-time setup. And so there's, I guess, a level of instructions that I highly encourage all of us to read that go through how you should actually set up for your particular strategy in your particular area. So now knowing men out there, I'm going to be very sexist against my own kind. We tend to not read instructions. So please go back and actually read that. But what it basically says is if you go into all of these tabs that start with the word setup, you're going to set these up as a one-time configuration to make sure that it's actually going to capture everything that you want for you. So you see, for example, that we've got stamp duty. I have tried to have stamp duty for Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, etc., and all the different breakdown of those tables. And I've also got links to where those rates were actually published. So you can actually then go and check at any one point in time to see whether or not those rates have been updated, and just come in and update the relevant tables. If you're in New South Wales, you'd update that table, for example. Similarly, there's a construction cost table. Now, this comes back to one of the questions we had a little bit earlier. So depending upon the kind of dwelling that you're creating, so this is a house, these are townhouses, and depending upon the level of fixtures and fittings, we have a different hourly rate, a different construction per metre rate that would actually apply to the dwelling. And then we have some regional variations that then apply to that, that depending upon the market cycle, will show you that, you know, in Adelaide, for example, if you're at the low end of the cycle where builders are not very busy, you're going to get the low end of the price point. And if you're at the high end of the cycle where builders are very, very busy, you're probably at the high end of the range. So this is a multiplier that applies to these rates that sit up here. Now, these are posted by BMT quantity surveyors. I don't take any ownership of these rates at all. This is a quantity surveyor who does thousands and thousands of quotes and estimates for construction cost along the way. So they've said these are the typical rates that apply. What I then do is, using these rates, knowing the particular strategy that you're doing, what you can then do is set up the kinds of dwellings that you would typically be creating in your strategies. So you're going to say, for example, you're going to give it a descriptive name. You're going to say, well, what is the size of the dwelling in a per square metre rate, whether or not there's any balconies, whether or not there's any basements. And then you're going to use this little drop down that's going to pull from the table that sits behind here to actually pull the appropriate rate in. If your council has some charges that apply to that, then what would be those charges to create that dwelling, and whether or not creating this dwelling actually is a GST applicable sale. Based on how you answer that, then you will actually get a typical cost to construct that, both ex-tax and inc tax, depending upon how you prefer to calculate that out. Then this is where the power comes in. So your typical costs. So in each of these columns here, you can put a descriptive name, and this becomes your different strategies and different scenarios that you might have for your particular strategy. And so this particular column here, I can see that for all my legal and accounting fees, so my purchase costs may have a particular cost. And as I go down, you'll see that all of these different individual line items, for some strategies, there is no cost, and for other strategies, there's a significant cost, and I can vary that every single time. These costs become your typical costs that you're then going to be using when you're actually doing your feasibility itself, okay? And so it's important that you get to become an expert in your particular strategy, an expert in your particular area, so you can work out what these typical costs are going to be. And then when you actually go and do your feasibility, it then just becomes a drop down to choose that strategy name, for example. Now the results then, I guess, populate themselves in a nice, easy to read format that is something that you can then take to your finance people, that breaks it down into very high level areas. And then there's the actual feasibility itself. So everything that was prior to that was really the back end setup, so that you can then see very quickly how we come to results so quickly, and whether or not we've got the right order of magnitude right up front. Now, what I've done is try to make this as human-friendly as possible in order to do. Wherever it's a spreadsheet, it becomes very difficult to guide people through the process. So I've used this color coordination up here to say what you could and should be doing at any one particular time at each stage. So for example, this color here, these are variable cells, but the data rarely changes. So for example, what state are you in? And that's going to help you with regards to what your land tax is, what your rates, sorry, not your rates, your stamp duties, that sort of thing. It's also going to help you to determine your construction cost calculation. If you're building, what is the build spec that you're going for? Is it a high, medium, or low spec? Sorry, I should say, where are you in the market cycle for the construction? Are you at the high end of the cycle or the low end of the cycle? And very similarly, again, I guess the spec that you're intending to build. So you'd adjust those one time, save this template, and then you'd use that over and over and over. Then what we do, so phase one, I would just be answering all of the yellow cells in column C. So what is the purchase price of my property? I'm just going to come up with a very fictitious project here. If I can purchase a property for, say, 700,000, now it's instantly known, because I'm in Queensland, it automatically knows what my stamp duty is. I then get to choose what is the typical strategy that I want to use for this particular one. So knowing, having done my site analysis, I can see the kind of strategy that might sit here. So I'm going to say it's a 2-lot subdivision with standard civils, for example, and you'll see instantly it starts to load in all of these typical costs here. Now, this has been done at a very high level, so you'll see that this is the heading. But if I actually expand each one of these elements out, that all of those individual line items that we were talking about before are actually sitting underneath the covers. So it's actually using those line items very, very detailed, but giving you a much simpler way to actually look at it. And it's telling you typically for this kind of project, these are the kinds of projects that you would have, I guess, 90% of the time. Whether or not you are paying any finder's fees in this particular project, so you may have to pay someone an introduction fee for handing you the deal. You don't have to, but you can do that either as a percentage of the purchase price or actually as a fixed fee. Whether or not there's any council credits that you may be able to apply to the site, and if so, how many credits there may be. So I know that for a very simple 1:2 subdivision, then chances are it's on one lot, so I get 1 credit. If you get any income during the project, so you're able to have some holding income on the property that helps you, I guess, offset some of those holding costs as you go. And then you've got your finance costs. So finance during your construction phase, sorry, during your initial acquisition phase, and then also during your construction phase. I also have preloaded in here that came from these typical costs all the way down the bottom. If I can scroll far enough down, here we have here the typical timeline that different stages of the project actually take. And so when I come over here, it's loaded these in. So I know that this particular strategy is going to take 9 months. That 9 months then gets applied to things like your finance costs, gets applied to your holding costs, and then amplifies all of that out. And then what is it that we're actually creating here? So if I'm creating 2 vacant blocks of land, creating 2 of them, what are they going to sell for? So maybe they sell for 450,000 as a guess. And that's it with regards to my data entry. So instantly you'll say, in this particular instance, here's my results. That is not a very profitable deal, right? And so what I'm trying to get to is how quickly I can get to a point of, do I even bother? But if my market research has said that maybe it's closer to 480,000, still not a very good deal. But if it's 520,000, now we're starting to get into the right sort of ballpark to make this, I guess, attractive to us. One of the other elements that I've done is, because of the fact that I understand how long the project is taking, so we've got in here, I guess, the duration of each of our stages, I can now say, well, what if I'm actually able to negotiate a delayed settlement and avoid some of those holding costs. So if I was to avoid, let's just say 3 months of holding costs, well, I've actually added 10,000 extra of profit into the deal because I've got that 3-month delayed settlement, for example. And so it's very quick for me to be able to get to a point of saying, well, if I know my purchase price, if I know the kind of strategy that I'm actually executing and the typical costs in it, and I know the sale of the finished product, I can very, very quickly get to an order of magnitude to say, should I actually be bothering to go any further? Now, as I said, this is not down to the dollar accurate on this first phase, but it's really, should I go to any more detail? If we then go to the second phase in analyzing it, now we're going to start to look at individual sections and say, well, knowing the complexity of this particular project, I don't think that my development approval is going to cost me 13,000. I think it's going to be something closer to 25,000. And you'll see that the typical cost is still sitting there, but the value that's actually used in my calculation has come from this overridden value. And so I can very quickly go and do my higher level assessment to say, well, for the uniqueness that is this particular site, here's the oversights that I'm actually going to be doing, and then use that to apply. And then when I want my super detailed level, then I can expand out each one of these individual line items, and I can go line by line by line and say, well, this particular line item is going to be 5,000. This one's going to be free. This one we didn't think was going to apply, but that's going to be 600. And you can see again what the typical cost was, what this cost is, and you can see what's actually been applied to it. So it really allows you those 3 stages, the quick and dirty, a little bit more detail, and then the, oh my goodness, I want to go to a ton of detail. And you'll notice that I've got a bunch of extra, whilst we've got over 200 different individual line items that sit in here, we've got a ton of different extra line items that you can add that might be unique to your particular strategy or your particular site. So that's QwikFeaso, folks. I'm sure there's a bucket load of questions that come out of that.
I have a few. So that is such an extensive feasibility, which is great, but it's good to know that you can do various levels of it, because not everyone's going to want to spend hours diving into detail for each site.
Well, I would actually encourage people to get to the point where they're looking at how quickly do I throw a site away, rather than going to the individual line item of every single element that goes into the full due diligence, because the quicker you can throw a site away, the more sites you can actually look at.
Yeah. And also, I know that you stress the importance of focusing on three suburbs, 3 strategies as well.
So not quite right. So 1 strategy, 1 council, 3 suburbs.
That. which means that you should be quite focused on your numbers anyhow, and there should only be a few things to change in your feasibility to get it to a point where you go yes or no. Yeah,
and I guess that really talks to the methodology that I approach, which is to try and break it down to its purest, simplest form. A number of people will look at a ton of different strategies. And so one day they're looking at subdivisions, the next day they're looking at renovations, the day after that they're looking at townhouses, and they become a jack of all trades and master of none. And they burn a lot of energy trying to actually become experts in each of those areas, and they never actually get the traction because it takes so much time to become an expert. Even if they do lock down a single strategy, they then tend to jump around between different council jurisdictions. And the reality is there's 537 different councils. And so even if you stick to one strategy, there's 537 different rules in how you apply that one strategy. And so that's why I try to get you to simplify it all the way down to say, pick your one council, so your one strategy and the one area, and you have one set of rules to learn. And that then helps you to become that area expert. By becoming the area expert, you can then start to analyze all of your suburbs to determine which suburbs are actually going to be profitable for your particular strategy. because every strategy works, but it doesn't work everywhere. And so we want you to narrow that down to say, well, where are the suburbs that are highly profitable and have a high number of opportunities that actually sit in it, which is why we say lock it down to three suburbs to start with, because the reality is you only need one deal to succeed. And if we can get you to narrow down like that, you become inch wide and mile deep. And so the level of knowledge that you get is, I guess, exponential compared to if you try to stick to that jack of all trades, master of none approach.
Sure. Another question from Malika. In your experience, how reliable are the BMT rates?
I'm going to say they are conservative. And that's the reality of it, because they don't want to be held accountable to, I guess, somebody saying, well, why couldn't I get this rate? Having said that, they are realistically conservative. So you can absolutely do better than what they promote, without a doubt. But if your feasibility is based on those conservative numbers and it shows profitability, then the chances are you're going to be able to squeeze that a lot harder when you actually get to the point of taking it through to construction. And those rates that they quote are also full turnkey costs. So they include all the things like driveways and landscaping and letterboxes and clotheslines and all those elements that people tend to forget to actually put in. So conservative, but they're certainly I rely on them, and I'm happy to. So.
And another question from me is around finance cost and interest rates. So this is one where, you know, if you're doing residential lending, it's going to be a certain rate, and if you're doing commercial lending with the big banks, it's another rate. And then if you're doing private lending, what's sort of the breadth of interest rates people can sort of expect?
Anywhere between the high 3s and the low 30s.
And 30s because it's?
Well, it comes down to, if you're able to stick to residential lending, which is only going to apply for your small scale developments, then you're going to be able to get, I guess, the low 3s, 4s and 5s. The challenge with that is that most banks are expecting those loans to last for 30 years. And when you, on day one, knock down their security and knock the house over, and, you know, go to apply to them to say, hey, I'd like your approval to subdivide this property, or, you know, add these extra dwellings on there that you've never disclosed to them up front, they can actually get quite upset in the process. And they can either ask you to repay the loan in full right up front because you misrepresented the loan, which I've seen done, or they will potentially get to a point where they say, well, we just won't lend to you again. So then next time around, you have to go to a different lender. So you have to make sure that you have a development-friendly lender up front. That's the first part. Yeah. And the development-friendly lender needs to be able to consider that land in itself is security, because at some point in time, you're going to have, you are highly likely to have vacant land sitting there because you've knocked down the existing house in order to construct the new something. Many of the banks don't like vacant land as security because it doesn't actually generate income. And if you go broke at that point in the project, they're stuck with something that doesn't generate income. So their holding costs become quite high. Mm. As you then go into the more commercial space, then your interest rates ratchet significantly depending upon the complexity and size of the deal and the level of security that you're actually offering. The difference, though, is that the commercial guys are very much aware of the fact you're going to be developing, and they factor that into their risk profile. Whereas the residential guys didn't factor that into their risk profile because you didn't tell them that you're actually developing. Mm. And so when it comes to the commercial rates, you're typically starting in the, I guess, the 9% range and probably up to 12% with the most typical commercial lenders. But as you try to get things like mezzanine finance and the like, or equity finance, then that starts to ratchet because you've got less equity in the deal. And so somebody's taking a risk position in your deal. And that's where it starts to get to the 20s and 30% mark. And then if you go into private finance, being individual high net worth people who might do a JV with you, then it turns into a profit split type of scenario.
Yeah, so it's important that people understand what sort of funding structure that they're implementing in their deals.
Absolutely, and the thing that I would say is you need to let go of the number that is the percentage interest rate. Instead, what you want to do is have a look at the dollar cost that costs you over the duration of the loan, and could you do the project in any other way without paying that dollar cost. And if you consider it as a cost of doing business, instead of, hey, I know that there's better rates out there, you'll sleep much better at night, and you'll be able to actually execute deals that other people can't, because you're looking at it as a pure numbers side of things. I don't, I have happily paid 15% interest in the past, and I did so because it made me plenty of money, and I wouldn't have got that money any other way other than paying 15%. So to me, I thought it was a very good investment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now my rain is getting much louder as we go, so I'm hoping you can hear me.
No, you're still loud and clear, Rob. It's all good. Another question from Matt: is there an ability within QwikFeaso to update those standard construction rates year on year?
I'm very much struggling to hear you because of my rain at my end, Cheryl.
Right. Can you see the chat box? Are you able to
let me see if I can bring it up. No, I cannot see it. I'm just going to close down a couple of windows and see if that helps me out. No, I cannot. Here we go. Got it. Yep. Is there an ability within QwikFeaso to do a cash flow analysis? The answer is no. It's not really intended for really complex projects. It's really intended for the much more simple style project that actually sits out there. The cash flow analysis side of things, you tend to be more when you're doing your much larger projects. I'm going to say it suits anything that is probably 10 townhouses and below. If you're doing anything bigger than that, then you probably want to scale to, I guess, some of the more commercial software platforms. And escalation of construction costs. I'm not quite sure what you're meaning in that regard, Cheryl.
So say, for example, that's usually you have fixed price construction, but say escalation of other costs in terms of, so I know Estate Master does that where it might be 2% escalation throughout.
I'm going to try and get something to plug in from a headset perspective, because it's
hear me, can you?
finding it near on impossible to hear. So
okay.
Give me 2 secs. Do you want to try again?
Okay. So we were talking about escalation of costs. Can you hear me? Not really?
Yeah, I can't hear it all.
Right. Next question. We'll address.
I have a plan B. That's much better. Luckily, I'm a technophobe. Sorry, a technophile, so I've got everything handy.
Technophile.
Okay, so what was the question again, Cheryl?
Does QwikFeaso allow you to, and I'm thinking that probably not from what you mentioned before with the cash flow, escalation of costs. So say, for example, with Estate Master, and I think even with Fee Study, you can escalate costs at, say, 2% per annum or whichever. And similarly with price, with revenue as well, you can escalate that.
I think what you're trying to refer to there is the fact that over time, I guess the cost of money is actually changing, and you're accelerating with that. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so no, it doesn't go into that level of detail. It is really intended to be, and hence the name QwikFeaso. It is meant to be a decision-making point to say, should I be putting more effort into this, rather than, I guess this is the one and only answer that I'm going to need, especially when you go to the bigger projects. It's trying to get you an answer in 30 seconds and not in 3 days.
And probably for projects that will take, say, no more than 2 years?
Yeah, correct. Yep. Yeah. So all of those other platforms, you need to enter everything every single time. And so you're going to spend hours and hours and hours loading those up to try and get to the point of actually doing the feasibility. Whereas, as you saw with mine, I can actually get an answer in seconds.
Yeah.
So it's not down to the dollar accurate when you get it in seconds, obviously, but it's giving you an order of magnitude to say, should I be bothering to put any more effort in? And if the answer is yes, then it may be that you need to jump to one of the other platforms to, to put two weeks worth of due diligence into that to capture that. But why would you put that level of effort in day one when you're trying to get locked down a site in days?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so next question, and I'm mindful of timing, so we'll probably take another few more and then start to wrap things up. Does that work for you, Rob?
Yeah, that works for me.
Cool. Andrew says, what is a good profit percentage on a residential project?
The $1 million question on profit. I'm quite controversial in this regard because my answer contradicts almost everybody that sits out there. The typical answer that you will hear is that people are looking for a 20% profit on cost type scenario. The challenge with that is that they forget the element of time in that equation. And so they typically are talking about a project that takes around 2 years. So it's a unit or a townhouse type strategy. And when you actually annualize that return, that 20% profit on cost on a 2-year project ends up to be about 10% per annum. My take on it is to say, well, I would much prefer to compare projects on that annualized basis, no matter what level of complexity it is. And I look for a 15% annualized return. And so if I'm doing a project that takes 3 months, and there are projects out there that take 3 months, if it gets me a 7% return in that 3 months time, if I annualize that, that's a 28% return. That's a fantastic level of return. That means my money is working super, super hard for a very short period of time. It also means that if I've got 2 projects that take a different duration, I'm not looking at the dollar return. I'm looking at that annualized return to work out how hard my money is actually working. And so I can compare a 12-month project against an 18-month project and determine whether or not one is, I guess, the highest and best use of my money.
Okay, so I hope that answers questions there. But if you're, I mean, because typically as well, I mean, people looking at profits, they might go from 20, 25%, but we also have to look at the like you said, the internal rate of return of that.
Yeah, it's a simplified way of doing an internal rate of return because a true IRR is a very complicated mathematical equation.
Okay. Any other questions before we start to wrap up? Yes. It's been an hour and a half of talking feasibilities.
Oh my goodness.
All right, Rob. Well, I think that's been a whole heap of information. I think it would be very helpful if anyone wanted to find out how to not use QwikFeaso, but even access and purchase QwikFeaso. How can they do that, and where do they need to go to?
So I've given you a couple of links, Cheryl, that you can, I guess, paste into Facebook because I can't access the Facebook Live from here on Zoom. But I guess QwikFeaso we sell for $250. So that you've got a link to send them through to that. That, as I said, is a, I think it's going to save you a bucket load of time if you actually specialize down into your one strategy and get to know those typical costs very, very well. other ways of engaging with me, I get around. I run monthly meetups, as you know. And so we run events in Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne every single month, depending upon the location. That changes from time to time. So the best thing that they can do is Google search Property Developer Network, and actually, it's what I'll do is I'll type it in here to help you post that out.
Excellent. And I know you've got a few information sessions coming up in the next few weeks, don't you?
Yeah, so glad that you mentioned that. So yes, and I'll just flick to the next slide, which is a perfect segue. So thank you for that. So the concept here is that just before Christmas, I put an email out to my community asking them what is their biggest property challenge. And I had over 250 odd responses that came back from that. And what I've done is actually collated that. And a number of those questions that they asked, when you actually consolidate it down, we had some questions where 40 odd people were asking the same thing, and other questions where 30 people were asking the same thing. So what I've tried to do is put on a one-off special event, depending upon your location. Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, we've got some different dates. Actually, I just noticed a mistake there. So
I was going to say, you're in Brisbane and Melbourne at the same day.
Yeah, that's not possible. So let me fix that right this very second. So that is the 15th. And through the magic that is Facebook, nobody can ever tell the difference. So these are going to be on the day of our normal meetup, but it is not our normal meetup. So it's going to be on the morning of, and then from there, then they can then attend the afternoon meetup session. We normally charge $25 for the afternoon meetups, but for anyone who registers beforehand, and you've got a link to that called Developer Launchpad there, Cheryl, if you flick that link in there, then anyone who registers for that can come along for free to actually learn about that, and then come along to the afternoon. So they can make an entire day of it. And I'm one of those people who always sits with a beverage in hand, and so we kick on socially afterwards for a drink or two afterwards. So if you want to make both a day and a night of it, I consider myself a drinking club with a property problem. Yes.
Excellent. Well, I thank you very much. It's been an absolute honour having you here, Rob. You did most of the talking, so that was easy for me.
Thank you.
Should have you here more often. Some really great questions, and definitely it's probably been one of our most popular sessions. So obviously it's been a burning question that a lot of people have. Great information about how to access the developer network there. If you're keen to attend one of the meetups, which has a fantastic structure. I really enjoy the meetups, and I think you've done a fantastic job there with the level of content and the presenters that you have each time as well, Rob. So
thank you. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Always an industry expert every single month, and always a member of our community sharing a real deal, warts and all. So you get to see the good, the bad, and the ugly of a deal.
Nice, nice. So if you're struggling with feasibilities, definitely hop on to QwikFeaso. For $250, that's actually really very, very reasonable, considering what you need to pay for a state master or fee study or anything else. Like I said, it's QwikFeaso for most people who are doing sort of small to medium sized developments. Peter says thank you. Malika says thanks. Michael, awesome information. Thanks, guys. All kudos to Rob here. So thanks, Rob. You've made me look good.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. No, thank you for the opportunity, and happy to help wherever we can.
Excellent, excellent. I'll put those links up on the comments and also on the session. This is recorded, so if anyone's missed this, I'll be putting this up on Tuesday at 8 p.m., which is our usual Business of Property time. So you haven't missed out. You can listen to it again. I have to apologize. I didn't press record until sort of 2 minutes in, so it's mainly just the input that we've missed there. Not a problem. All right, we've still got another hour and 30 minutes of Rob. All right, Rob.
I think that's plenty.
With the rest of your sort of sessions in February. And thank you. I think that was full of information, and I think we learned a lot from there.
You're welcome.
Other questions, feel free to ask, set it up in the comments, and Rob or myself will respond.
I will do what I can to get to it over the next couple of days.
All right. Thanks. Good night.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, Cheryl. Bye, everyone.
Bye.